allowed to happen, it would have crippled the Midwest. 1 million jobs lost, suppliers shut down, domestic and foreign car manufacturing plants forced to close. Yet in our third story, despite that grim near miss, the Republican Party continues to campaign against the bailout of the auto industry, even though new sales data out tonight proving its success. Delaware Senate nominee Christine O'Donnell, just the latest Republican, to rail against the government measures taken to save American automakers and thus 1 million American jobs.
Our leaders in Washington have lost their way and no longer follow the constitutional principles. Otherwise, we wouldn't have Obamacare. We wouldn't have these massive bailouts. We wouldn't be taking over GM.
Like asking a kindergartner to explain Einstein. The so-called taking over of General Motors has actually worked. The company's been turning a profit, stabilized its market share. This afternoon, GM announced plans to manufacture a new compact car, the Buick Verano, thus planning to restore more than 1,500 jobs lost at a Michigan plant that was idled just last year. The Detroit News reporting that once that plant is up and running again, it is expected to employ workers on 2 shifts and turn out 160,000 vehicles a year. The first round of bailout funds dispensed under that well-known liberal union sympathizer George W. Bush continued under President Obama, Republicans blasting the intervention as a way to help the unions. Even though Congressman Barney Frank noted the single most effective thing that the federal government has done to preserve and set the basis for manufacturing in America was to intervene with General Motors and Chrysler. Ford never received government funds, but arguably was saved by the government's action. It has been boasting healthy profits since, while Morgan Stanley predicts increased earnings for the company, estimating Ford's ability to generate revenue has been significantly underestimated. This as new data from the auto research firm TrueCar.com shows sales are up for American brand cars, even as buyer incentives have been decreased. Meanwhile, foreign car sales remain flat despite an increase in buyer incentives. Joining me now is the Obama administration's former lead auto advisor, counselor to the Secretary of the Treasury, author of Overhaul, Stephen Rattner. Mr. Rattner, good evening. Thank you for your time.
Thanks very much for having me.
What kind of credibility do those who deride the bailout now, with this new evidence in, have?
I think with every passing day, with every piece of new evidence, they have less and less credibility. You laid out the case very clearly and very effectively. Sales are doing well and are up for the Detroit 3. Profits are back. The companies are healthy. They're beginning small car production in Michigan. I think you said it all very, very clearly.
And about one thing we didn't talk about, Cash for Clunkers. That program was an utter failure, too?
No, quite the opposite. Cash for Clunkers not only created a huge surge in demand for cars at a time when our economy needed stimulus, and it was a stimulus program, but in fact sales didn't drop off afterward nearly as much as the pessimists and the critics of the program said it would. And so, in fact, Cash for Clunkers was another great success that many people made fun of before it was put into place.
This kind of knee-jerk automatic reaction that suggests this was all done to benefit the unions, and the unions run and ruin the auto industry depending on which decade you're in, how would they explain the success of Ford? I mean, Ford did not go bankrupt. Doesn't it still have unions?
It does. Ford, in fact, faced exactly the same set of issues as General Motors and Chrysler. The same unions, as you pointed out, the same competition from Japan, the same gasoline prices, the same credit crisis, and yet Ford got through it. And so while I think there's a lot of responsibility for this problem in a lot of shoulders and a lot of hands, including some with the unions, I don't think that was by any means the largest part of the problem. And I would also say that I was in the White House when these decisions were made, and these decisions were not made on behalf of the unions. Just as President Bush, as you pointed out, didn't make them on behalf of the unions. They were made on behalf of the country as a whole at a critical time in our economy.
Do you think the White House, either politically or for the sake of this kind of intervention, is doing enough in terms of talking this up at this point and reminding people, or even just underscoring for people that it worked? Because the perception from many political quarters that we don't necessarily have to elucidate about is that it was a failure and socialist this and disaster that.
It's very frustrating to all of us who were involved with any of these rescue operations. I think is a nicer word than bailouts, actually. But the president has tried. He went out this summer and he visited a Ford plant, he visited a Chrysler plant, he visited a GM plant, as well as many ancillary types of auto companies. And I think the problem is that there's just so much noise around this and so much browbeating of this issue that it's just been very hard for him to break through. So I think he's trying, and certainly he wants this to be perceived as a success because it was a success.
Stephen Ratner, the former counselor to the Secretary of Treasury and lead auto advisor on, and we'll use your term, the rescue. Thank you kindly.
Thank you.